Sorry, things seem to have frozen on my side. Give me a minute. Right, that looks better. Okay, now the topic of ethics and responsibility is, of course, a very important one. But I have to say that I am by no means the expert on it. Colleen Aldous, in fact, has been on our local ethics committee, the Biomedical Research and Ethics Committee, for many years, and knows all the ins and outs, whereas my association with ethics has always just been as a consumer and as somebody who attends lectures and thinks about it and answers questions and so on. So in the absence of any real background of knowledge on the subject of ethics, I took myself off to the internet and just did a bit of searching and found what I thought were some excellent summaries of what really is useful for us to know as practical researchers. Firstly, the background. There have been a number of incidents of very serious violations of human rights over the last century, which led to a major international move to put this right and to codify the requirements for researchers. Some of these you will have heard of. The first was the Second World War and the experience of the German Nazi researchers who were making use of people incarcerated in concentration camps unfairly, against their will, and with a complete abuse of any human right. They were actually using them for research. You may have heard of some of the research that was done. Cruel things were done to twins to see the differences between them, usually ending in mutilation or death. Prisoners were submerged in buckets of ice water to see how long they would survive, with a view to improving the survival of German pilots shot down over the sea during war, and so on and so on. So as recorded here, at least 70 medical research projects involving cruel and often lethal experiments were conducted in these concentration camps. Okay, and more than 7,000 victims of such experiments have been documented, usually coming from marginalized groups, including the Jews, the Poles, Gypsies, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, gay people, and Catholic priests. So an absolutely horrendous indictment, not just of society, but of the medical profession. You will have heard of Dr. Joseph Mengele and other Nazi physicians who carried out these experiments. So at the end of the war, there were the Nuremberg trials, in which many of these were tried and many were hanged and others imprisoned for long periods. And this ultimately led to the Nuremberg Code, which is one of the codes which underlies the ethics principles we apply today. But there were other less in your face, but equally shocking examples. One that's always conducted was the Tuskegee experiment. A national body, the United States Public Health Service, conducted a study of syphilis from 1932 to 1972. And their study subjects were rural, poor African Americans in the South of America. And they recruited people who had syphilis and then observed the natural history of the illness. Now you'll notice that there was a very big difference between 1930 and 1972. In 1932, there was no treatment. So you could more or less agree, I suppose, that it was appropriate just to follow patients. By 1972, of course, there was treatment. Penicillin had been around for 30 years and was known to be highly efficacious in treating syphilis. And yet, despite this, the researchers did not inform their subjects that there was now treatment available for them, and did not provide penicillin as part of their treatment. So they can continue to watch these subjects deteriorating, developing tertiary syphilis, general paresis of the insane, and so on, without in any way intervening. This is another major factor which promoted a new stress on ethics standards. So let's look at a summary of some of the ethical principles underlying biomedical research. And I have to say, this is a topic that can be very dry and very boring. It's important when you actually have to apply the principles, and it's interesting if you are sort of philosophically minded and like to go into the philosophical basis of all of this. But if I could persuade people in the audience just to unmute the microphones, switch on, ask a question, make a comment, express surprise, whatever it is, it'll already make the afternoon very much more enjoyable for all of us. Right. So one of the first principles is the principle of essentiality. Is the research actually essential? Is it actually useful? Large volumes of research, as you can imagine, are actually conducted every year, which don't actually really benefit everybody. Now, as long as nobody's been harmed, well, then I suppose there's no problem. Often, however, people may not have been harmed, but they've been inconvenienced. It's not really fair to bring patients in for special visits or to expect them to pay for transport to come and see you to produce research that's really of no benefit to anybody. And as a subtext of this, a very important one is, if research is not going to work, if you can see that in advance, then it's generally regarded as being unethical to carry it out. So if, for example, you decide to do a study, you find the sample size necessary to show statistical significance from your statistician, but it's quite clear that with the research, the resources available to you, there's no way you can reach that sample size. That means that your research is not going to result in any meaningful conclusion, which means it can't be used. The conclusion cannot be used. And that's generally thought to be unethical to embark on research under those circumstances. But again, we are making the distinction here between research which inconveniences or harms people and what I suppose many of our master's students actually do, sort of practice research. Merely retrieving folders from a registry and going through them and doing calculations may not benefit humanity, but I suppose you could argue that it hasn't really harmed anybody either. So that is something I think that we have to consider quite often. The second principles are the ones that you're well aware of: voluntariness, informed consent, and community agreement. And those three phrases actually in many ways mirror the way our whole understanding of ethics has evolved over the last number of decades. First principle, it should be voluntary. Nobody should be informed to participate as a subject in research. Nobody should be required to, nobody should be forced to do so. Okay. But then the next step was to say, yes, but people may agree, but would they have agreed if they actually knew exactly what was going to be done to them? So the principle of informed consent followed that one of voluntariness. In other words, somebody can't agree or consent to be involved in anything if they don't actually understand what it is they're giving consent for. So this has risen to the whole a requirement for informed consent, which has just got more and more and more comprehensive, and therefore in many ways more and more and more time-consuming and even difficult for the researcher to apply over the years. Much the same, of course, goes in medicine for medical procedures, but it's generally regarded that nobody should have to give consent for anything if they don't understand every single aspect of what is going to be done and what the implications are for them. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And then the third principle really now is that community agreement, is that people are drawn from the community, and the community itself has to agree that it would be appropriate for that research to be done. For argument's sake, you may wish to go into one of our local, for example, township communities or informal settlement communities. People there may agree to have research done on them, but the community as a whole may not agree that it is in the community's benefits that that sort of thing is done. And there's now a very general requirement that one has to consider the needs and wishes and rights of your community, and not just of the people in it. Okay, so when research entails treating any community, those principles, voluntariness, informed consent, apply to the community as a whole. So that is something that's also becoming much more difficult as time goes on. And again, you can see that the principle is important, but it certainly makes getting consent that much more difficult. And of course, there's always the very real risk to the researcher, that is, of coming up with an excellent research proposal, but finding that they are unable to do it because there is resistance in the community to that particular study being done. That, unfortunately, is very, very sad. It is very much a case of society as a whole having moved on from the situation where the researcher, the scientist, the doctor was regarded as a sort of special person whose wishes and desires overrode the rights and expectations of others. This is a very important one, principles of non-exploitation. And this, of course, is also one that's highly relevant to us in the developing world, the less developed nations. Okay, it is felt that certain groups are particularly vulnerable to being exploited. Okay, we started off with that example, prisoners in concentration camps, but the same goes today for prisoners in our prisons, for inmates of hospitals for the mentally ill, and so on and so on. Even where it looks as though it could be entirely voluntary, there's often the risk of exploitation. If you were to wish to do a research in a school, you may find that the subjects, the school children, will feel obligated to agree to take part because of pressure applied to them by their teacher. And you have to foresee that and foresee that there's likely to be that sort of pressure, and that they are therefore likely to be, or possibly could be, exploited. Another major issue of exploitation is cost. Where treatment is not available because it's too expensive, and somebody now offers you the possibility of receiving that treatment if you participate in a research trial, well, then that clearly raises the possibility that you as the subject are being exploited. But this, of course, is a particularly difficult ethical issue, because there's also the point that you are giving that person the opportunity to be treated, and which they would not otherwise have. So it's not entirely clear who is actually exploiting who in that situation. The fact that this gives rise to very serious risks of exploitation is very well understood, and has given rise to important rules which are very important to understand if you are conducting any sort of research that involves treating people as opposed to just observing. Mm-hmm. One of the things, for example, has been, one, as soon as it becomes clear that the treatment under research is actually active and effective and working, the trial has to be stopped. And that drug has to be offered to everybody, both those on placebo and those on control. And there are various rules as to for how long afterwards that cover must actually continue. The whole idea is to avoid the situation which has happened previously, including with HIV in this country many years ago, of patients receiving treatment while the trial continued. And once the trial stopped, treatment was withdrawn, and they suddenly found themselves untreated for a potentially life-threatening illness. I think we're all aware of the principles of privacy and confidentiality, and a lot of your preparation for the records that you use in your research is going to be based on privacy and confidentiality. Okay. Unfortunately, this too raises very serious issues that make research extremely difficult for us to carry out. Just some of the examples you've probably encountered already or have heard of or will encounter. Firstly, when records are anonymized. That's all very well. It means that nobody can go back and state that person A was one of the people with syphilis as opposed to one of the controls. But on the other hand, if you need to revisit your research for any purpose, for example, you come across something very interesting, a further question that you'd love to answer, it may now be impossible because you can no longer state which patient relates to which set of records. So this is a major problem that does arise from time to time. And a lot of our efforts when we do anonymize our records are to try and find the sort of the sweet spot between complete anonymity, which means that we cannot have any further recourse to the subjects or the patients, and sufficient anonymity that their privacy is preserved. So this can be very difficult, and we won't go into details. When a situation arises, this is the sort of thing to think of, and you really need to take yourself off to the internet, do a lot of reading on the ways around this, consult your ethics board, and find out what you can do. But on the other hand, for the reasons I mentioned, don't avoid it. It's a tragedy if you were to find that you cannot go back to your subjects, you cannot re-access their records because of the way in which they've been anonymized. If in fact it could have been avoided if you had worded the consent differently and made other arrangements for confidentiality and anonymization with the ethics committee. So be extremely careful of this privacy and confidentiality. It works both ways. It can benefit your subjects, obviously. It can harm them if it's not done properly. But it can also harm your own research if you find that you have limited yourself so tightly that you can't actually do things that really are worth doing and are in everybody's interests to do. Principles of precaution and risk minimization. I mean, this obviously goes without saying. Okay, due care and caution, all stages, to make sure that the research participant and those affected by it are not put to any appreciable risk. It has to include plans for detecting things going wrong at an early stage. And as you probably know, if you're conducting pharmaceutical research, you've not only got to state in advance in your ethics application and your protocol what monitoring you will do for adverse responses, but you've also got to state in advance what you will do if you find them, and you've also got to carry insurance to pay all the medical costs of anybody in your study who suffers harm as a result of it. So again, this is a major component, and you can see that it's very important, obviously, but it's yet one more thing that makes modern research on human subjects quite difficult to do. Greatly increases expense, greatly increases the time and thought and effort necessary for preparation. So one more thing to bear in mind. Basically, if somebody were to develop some sort of harm which lasted lifelong as a result of your research, you would be expected to take responsibility for their medical care for the rest of their lives and for any other loss that they might suffer. Sixth is the principle of professional competence. Okay, right. I think that is pretty clear cut, isn't it? You have to know what you are doing. I'm always going on, and I said it last week, you'll recall, that the protocol is 30 or 40% of the learning, of a PhD. If you're going to conduct ethical research, then you have to know what you're doing, which is why it's so important that by the time your protocol is finished and submitted, you should be an expert on what it is you're going to do, and not blindly and naively rushing into something that you don't really understand yourself. You may be a student, but if you're conducting research on human subjects, then they have the right to expect that you're competent and qualified, not just as a doctor if you're a doctor, or a nurse if you're a nurse, but also as a researcher. Okay, it's unethical, as we said, to conduct bad research. Right. Principles of accountability and transparency. This is another problematic one. And if you follow the news on this, the science news, the literature on research itself, and so on, you'll know that as more and more and more evidence is uncovered of dodgy research, of outright fraud, so the need to be absolutely transparent in what you're doing and your results is being increasingly highlighted. And we are fast approaching the stage. It's already happening with some of the best journals, where all your research data have to be made freely available on the web, all of it, not just a summary of it, and not just your conclusions or your results, so people can actually go back themselves and look for fraud and look for mistakes you may have made in terms of both calculations and so on, but also interpretation, and see if they themselves are unable to perhaps draw different conclusions from your data than you yourself did. We're coming from a history where your research data was very much your own private property and was jealously held and guarded and not shown to anybody else in case they stole it. But unfortunately, because of this very high prevalence that's become aware of poor research, dodgy research, and outright fraudulent research, it's become more and more and more necessary for complete transparency. So at the very least, you're probably aware of the rule that all your research data has to be kept for at least 5 years. It can't be thrown out. And that's so that appropriate bodies can come and look at your research in the event that fraud is suspected or anything else of that sort. But as I said, we're moving from the period where you just keep it for post hoc monitoring to a stage where it actually has to be freely available in real time all the time for people to have a look at. And you may well be aware that the whole ivermectin saga with COVID, the problems all started when a commercial body in the United States that actually aggregates medical records and then subjects them to research. So they're a commercial body, but they do research on other people's data. Okay. Published work suggesting that ivermectin was effective. Eventually, people began to suspect that something was up, and when they went back, they found all sorts of things. Patients who'd apparently been treated before the study had even started, patients whose records were could not even be found, patients from hospitals that claimed to have no knowledge that their data was being used for research, and so on and so on. So sadly, it's become a very serious issue. The reason is, of course, that research has very many personal benefits to the people doing the research and those who fund it. Okay, everything from income. People make money from doing their research, from their grants and everything else. They're employed to do research. Okay, they get promoted if they've done research and been well published, and so on and so on and so on. So all the time there is very sadly powerful, perverse incentives to publish work, even if it's not of the best quality, and in some cases, sadly, even if it's completely bogus and fraudulent. The next principle is that of the maximization of public interest and distributive justice. Long word, that one. Okay. The point there is that everybody should benefit from our research, including the research participants and the community from which they are drawn. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about subjects in a country such as ours, in Africa in general, being very, very prone to exploitation. Companies come in from overseas, from the developed world. They find thousands of patients with HIV who are untreated, I think 20, 30 years ago, which is great for them because they've now got treatment-naive patients. So they conduct trials of new antiretrovirals on them, find that they work, close the trial, disappear back to America, and the next thing, hundreds and thousands of American citizens with HIV are receiving treatment, while the hundreds of thousands in Africa continue to sicken and die. So this particular rule in many ways emerged from that. One of the hallmarks of exploitation in research is this parachuting into other people's countries, doing a study, getting a result, and then applying the result for the benefit of your own community or society back home, particularly when there are financial considerations to that as well. So that's another very important principle. This, I'm sure you're well aware, is also one that's becoming increasingly well understood and increasingly stressed. The public domain. It's thought to be unethical that you do research findings. You find that, for example, giving penicillin to patients with syphilis cures them, but then you don't let the rest of the world know that. I'm making up a silly example now, but maybe you want to get a reputation as the one person in the world who can actually cure syphilis. Now, you don't tell everybody how you're doing it, but all these unfortunate people with syphilis flock to your clinic or your hospital, receive penicillin, they don't know what it is, and get better. And so, of course, you drum up a huge clientele for yourself, people flying from all over the world to come and get the treatment. The whole idea had been, had you informed the world of your findings, well, then patients could have been treated at every doctor's surgery everywhere in the whole world. So the general belief now that all research has to be placed in the public domain as soon as possible, not only so that everybody can benefit from it, but also so that it is available to be critiqued, to be looked at, to be considered as to whether it's good research, bad research, or even fraudulent research. This has led to the whole, public domain publishing, the open access publishing story. The idea being that if you do research, if it's in an open access journal, then everybody can read it, and not only those who can afford to subscribe to that journal. And as we ourselves well know, sitting here in Africa, the same applies even more to some of you who might be in other countries north of us in Africa. Many of our medical school libraries cannot afford the same breadth of subscription of North American and European universities. So if a really good study is published in a journal to which we cannot subscribe, then we may not be able to fully use that information for the benefit of our patients and our community. So the open access publishing was actually brought about by high-minded ethical researchers to deal with that. They said it's unfair that people are prevented from reading about research because they can't afford to subscribe to a particular journal. They also said that it's unfair that people are paying good money to do research, and then the journals are making a profit out of publishing it. They should really be paying the researcher in order to publish that result, but sadly it doesn't work like that. I have to say, though, as from the point of view of researchers in a country such as ours, this hasn't always been a particularly good thing. Previously, if you found a journal, you published in it, it cost you nothing. Now many of the journals are open access, and they want 30 or 40,000 rand from you for paper to publish your paper. And that is a very serious issue for many of our students and researchers in our universities. I mean, I'm just helping a PhD student at the moment who's just submitted her thesis and has had 5 papers, all accepted by open access journals, but each one wants 20 or 30,000 rand for the publishing. Now she's got to raise 150,000 rand to get published. So that's a major issue. If you are part of a grant, then one of the important steps in applying for a grant is to state upfront how much it's going to cost you to publish and make sure that the grant covers that. Right, this sounds like a good one, and not just for research, but many other areas of life as well. The principles of totality of responsibility. Okay, if you do research, you are responsible for it. You can't hide behind other people. You take professional and moral responsibility that the thing has been done properly. And the institutes where research is carried out and those who pay for the research should also have to take responsibility. And sadly, you can be very seriously let down in this regard by your co-authors, okay, and collaborators. There have been many, many examples, and they happen all the time, of very decent, responsible researchers having to eat humble pie and apply for a retraction of their papers, saying that they did not know that one of their co-authors had invented the data or what have you. Obviously, it reflects very, very badly on those good people. So it is something you always have to guard against. If your name is on a paper or on a project, you must be absolutely convinced at all times that your co-workers are being ethical, responsible, and honest, and not doing anything that you yourself would not stand for. This is something that happens more and more and more. It's very flattering when somebody asks you if you could be an author on their paper. It may give you some amount of work to do, but it's very, very rare that you then go back and demand that person's results, their data, and go through it yourself to make absolutely sure that there has been no fraud. But there have been many, many examples recently. Ivermectin, there were many examples of this again, of people putting their names to articles. And only later did it become clear that the data were actually fraudulent. But not all the authors who'd signed off on that actually knew that it was fraudulent. Right. I'm going to look at it now just from another angle, from another set of references. But let's just stop for a second and see if we can persuade anybody to talk, comment. Anybody like to say anything or pass a comment or ask a question?
Yes, Professor. Good morning. Good morning,
Hello.
colleagues. Yes, I am at the stage where now I've just completed, I'm doing a retrospective study. So I've just completed my data collection, pretty much into, well, I should say, I would think completing my data cleaning, and I've actually started my data analysis. But listening to the last point that you made, Professor, in terms of the having persons be co-authors and so on, because I'm at the stage where I have in my plans to speak to a few persons whom have been assisting me in terms of, you know, when I have questions in respect of the data and how I should go about it. I'm seriously considering a few, at least one or two of those persons, one being one of our local pathologists as one of the persons who can be a co-author, so to speak. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I'm skilled in data analysis, being, having an EP background and stats background, but that person, I'm not so sure as to their level. So for me, I guess, how would you advise me in terms of helping them to fully, they may understand the data as I present it, maybe in a tabular form, the broad information, but in terms of the granular matters it relates to some of the analysis that I would have done, how would you suggest that I get them up to speed, so to speak, in having a fair understanding, so that in their willingness to contribute or desire to contribute, that they feel very confident in doing so?
Okay, I'm not too sure exactly what the situation is that you're describing, though I can think of different ways in which that could be playing out. Firstly, obviously, you have to have no hesitation whatsoever in believing that they are likely to be honest and that there's no reason for them not to be honest. Then secondly, if you are the principal researcher, if you want to call it that, then it's absolutely essential that you also convince yourself that that person is competent to do whatever is necessary for the research. And I'm not only talking about competence as a pathologist, but also competent in terms of whatever input they give into your data. So you yourself will then actually have to really check every single thing that they provide you with and ensure that both you and that pathologist are in full agreement as to what was required and whether what's been submitted actually meets that requirement. One of the things we do talk about, just leaving the ethics of it aside, of course, is one of the most difficult things is collaborating with other people, even research assistants. You may, in all honesty, accept something that they give you and do work on it, only to find out that they had interpreted what they gave you differently from what you did. And so basically the information you're putting in is being used for the wrong purpose. They thought they had to provide you with data on X, and you're expecting data to tell you about Y. You don't detect that there's a mismatch there, and so you end up doing an inappropriate analysis of that data. So I'm not too sure if I'm really answering, but that's what I'm really saying is two things. One, from the moral point of view, you have to be absolutely certain that they are honest. Two, you have to be absolutely certain that they are competent at producing whatever data they are giving you, and that they are giving you the sort of data that you want in order to do the analysis. Has that helped, or am I missing the point?
Oh, yes, Professor, that has certainly helped. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay, let's carry on then.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, hello.
Okay, thank you so much for this very informative presentation. I would want to just pose a general question regarding issues around minority groups, which appear to be overprotected by ethical guidelines in terms of engaging them in research. Don't you think that they somehow miss a lot of services or interventions which could be of benefit to them, as most researchers might be scared by the long and rigorous hectic process of obtaining ethical approval for them?
I'm absolutely sure that you're right. Okay, there's no doubt that protecting groups that society regards as vulnerable has many good results, but also has some negative consequences. And that's just one of the ones that you've mentioned. People avoid working with that group for fear of all the difficulties that arises from it. Just think of some parallel examples, in our professional practice as doctors. You read about doctors who won't stop at an accident because they're scared that they will be sued by the patient. If something goes wrong. And obviously, if you stop at an accident, it's hardly the ideal circumstances in which to provide medical treatment. That's just one example. Parts of the world, there's a major shortage of certain specialities like obstetricians. And the reason is nobody wants to work in obstetrics because the rate and risk of being sued is so high, and so on, and so on, and so on. So yes, it is a worrying thing. And there's no doubt that sometimes vulnerable groups are avoided because of the feeling that you'll be not just subjected to all of these steps in order to get permission, but that people perhaps who don't have all the insight that they should have will actually look down on you and accuse you of being exploitative, despite the fact that you're doing everything in your power not to be exploitative. You will see many of these issues playing out at societal level, things like the whole debate about genders, LGBTQI, and all the rest of it. It's just about nothing one can actually say or do in that arena that doesn't actually upset somebody. And even some groups within that community that disagree strongly with other groups in that community as to about who they are or what they should be called, or whether it's fair to use gender-based pronouns, etc., etc., etc. So I'm wandering off the point a bit, but there is no doubt that as we as society become more and more and more sensitive to issues involving minorities, vulnerable groups, so we enter more and more and more of a minefield in terms of trying to do anything in that arena without offending somebody. So I can only agree with you. Did you have any particular examples in mind?
An example could be maybe engaging children as a minority group just to understand the migration trends across borders, possibly looking at, the challenges in transit and also what could be the factors, pull and push factors contributing to the migration processes. And I think this evidence from such an engagement could possibly go a long way in coming up with policy framework, child protection policies and interventions. But then you find that obtaining a clearance to conduct such a research cannot be easy, just as an example.
I think that's an excellent example, and it just shows in many ways, the sadness of it. Because as you yourself have said, the results of such research could be hugely beneficial to children themselves, not necessarily those children, but all children, in a similar situation. Yes, so it is very much something that we have to be aware of, and it is a difficult matter. One of the problems is that people who draw up rules for this sort of thing try and draw up very strict, inflexible rules covering every situation. And as you well know, in life, that's usually just not possible to do, which means that you can come up with a completely sensible, moral, ethical, and good project to do, only to find that it infringes against the letter of one or other rule or regulation, meaning that you can't do it. And that is certainly something that I've encountered, and I think many other people have as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. It is an important issue. If nothing else, though, for the rest of our audience, it just points out that working with human subjects, even animals to some extent, is a minefield. And you've got to be extremely careful about how you approach things. It's not easy, and you may have no idea of just who you're going to upset and what about, and it might have very serious consequences. One that, of course, we are well aware of in this country is the whole issue of race. That is a minefield in itself. Is it ethical to conduct studies comparing races? What should members of such a race group be called? Is it even appropriate to say that there are such things as races and the people are members of them? We won't go into that today, but you're well aware that this is another very, very, very contested subject. And again, for good reason, given the very serious history of racism throughout the world, including in this country, and which continues in various guises even today. But in grappling and trying to deal with that in research, many problems can be caused and people can be hurt, including researchers who were perhaps naive and did not intend in any way to be offensive, let alone to be racist, but in fact behave in ways which are interpreted as that. So, a good point. I'm glad you brought that up as well. Right, let's go back to the presentation. Right, there we are. Okay, right. So this is the view of the American Psychological Association, the APA, which you probably know is an immensely powerful force for research throughout the world. They take their job extremely seriously, and many of the principles brought up by the APA, in fact, have gone on to inform a lot of other biomedical research. So these are some of the points that they make. I put this because this is a different line here, okay? 1, discuss intellectual property frankly. I'll just read this out aloud for you. Academia's competitive publish or perish mindset can be a recipe for trouble when it comes to who gets credit for authorship. I'm quite sure that some of you have already had to deal with these issues. So the work is done, and then the trouble starts. The head of department demands that his name is placed on the paper. Somebody else who just shared a few patient notes with you also wants to be placed on the list of authors. Okay, and so it goes on and on. The statistician who did a t-test for you wants to be on the list of authors. And you, as a young student, a PhD student, faced with all these important people, may find it extremely difficult to say no. The end result is that you've done 98% of the work, and your paper has 4 authors, so it looks as though you only did a quarter of the work. In fact, you did 98% of it. One of them, that's the head of a department, did nothing. The person who shared the subject, the patients with you, I guess, did 1%, and the statistician did 1% because it's their job, and they paid to do stats. They weren't really part of your research. It would be a bit like paying the putting the typist to type the thesis or the paper on your list of authors. Right, so we'll just talk briefly a bit about that later, but bear that in mind. The suggestion here is it's often best to discuss up front who is going to be an author. Not everybody who collaborates has to be an author. Not everybody who supplies data has an expectation of being an author. Not everybody who reads through something or does a calculation for you has an expectation of being an author. And it is now universally accepted that people do not deserve to get authorship because they are your boss or your head of department or anything else like that. And even just the other day, I was hearing about very serious issues and of a student who was forced to resign from their job because their HOD put such pressure on them, either to agree that they would get to supervise a study which was already going on in another institution and to be an author, or to get out of the job. They left And I've been advising them to see a labor lawyer, because that to me is what's called constructive dismissal, when you're forced to resign because staying on in the job is intolerable. So that's the first thing. Discuss these issues up front. And when you do have problems with these issues at a later stage, get advice early. Speak to your academic lead of research, or your dean, or your deputy vice chancellor, or a senior colleague that you trust, whoever it may be. But these issues arise all the time. The second, and I can't stress this enough for those of us who are clinicians, be conscious of multiple roles. I've had this problem myself. What do you do when you are a researcher? So, and one of the patients that you're studying, who's not actually, your patient in the medical sense, now comes to you with medical problems. Now you are very much in a conflicted role. Are you the objective observer that a researcher is meant to be? Or are you the person that is in a subjective relationship with that patient, who's required to make them better as quickly as possible and as soon as possible? It can be extremely difficult. It's always best to try and keep those roles apart. If at all possible, clinicians managing the patient should be kept separate from those actually conducting the research on them. Now, as you can imagine, that's not always possible, but it can be extremely difficult. And for as long as you are both researching and treating that patient, you are subject to a conflict of interest. And it really is best then to try and keep those roles separate, which means including somebody else in the therapeutic relationship if you're in the research relationship. So bear that in mind. Follow informed consent rules. Okay. And as we mentioned earlier, these have become more and more and more and more complicated and difficult as time goes on. So don't make this up. Find out what is necessary from your local ethics committee and make sure that you carry it out extremely conscientiously. Also, of course, we do have to remind ourselves that ethics is not just a matter of keeping outside bodies happy. It is also a matter of our own personal honor, our own personal moral code. So you do not want to find yourself in the situation of having to admit to yourself privately that you have skimped a little bit on the informed consent because you're worried that if you really do inform fully, that the person may say, no thanks, in that case, I don't want to participate in the research. That's a very serious conflict of interest that often arises with informed consent. We know that if we are completely truthful with informed consent, we might have to mention some really horrible things that can happen. And then the patient may decide, well, very well, thank you, but they're not going to participate. They may hear, you may get cancer. They don't pick up the part 0.00001% of people may get cancer, which is probably less than it is, in the community as a whole anyway. So this is a major conflict of interest that you're going to come up with. So it's best to follow the informed consent rules and be conscientious about it. So here follows a long list of some of the things that you really have to inform subjects about. Purpose, duration, procedures. The fact that they have a right to decline and must not in any way feel pressured or feel that they'll be punished for declining to participate, and that they have the right to withdraw at any stage, no questions asked. You've got to inform them about reasonably foreseeable factors that may influence their willingness. Let's say a lumbar puncture is necessary, which they would not otherwise have as part of their treatment. But you've got to understand a lumbar puncture can be uncomfortable. Occasionally it can be dangerous. This is what could go wrong. And sadly, that's going to put a number of people off from wishing to participate in your study. They've also got to know what prospective research benefits are so that they can make an informed decision as to whether it's even worth their while, to take part. If there really is very little benefit for anybody, then they may feel, well, why must I waste my time participating? Okay. Limits of confidentiality, incentives for participation, everything from being paid, through to getting access to treatment or care that they would not otherwise have. And then, as you know, the information up front as to who can be contacted in the event of any questions. And increasingly, it's now necessary for informed consent to actually document every single one of these things that the person is consenting to, sometimes with an initial next to each clause, as opposed to just a bland statement, I consent to be involved in this study. So it's also been suggested we cover the likelihood, magnitude, duration of harm or benefit, okay, and the fact that there are specific mandates for experimental treatment research. All sorts of points covering that, which do not apply to observational research. Okay, and the classic example in our setting, of course, of experimental research is drug studies. I've mentioned earlier all the steps that have to be taken to foresee harm, to deal with harm, to take responsibility for harm, and to pay for harm if it costs. The fourth is confidentiality and privacy. Okay, best way to avoid confusion is a frank discussion with the participant about confidentiality, how their data will be used, what will be done with case materials, and so on and so on. So they must know exactly what privacy they're being offered when they give their consent. And there have been many examples in history of patients giving consent, only to be very upset and very angry afterwards and say that they didn't know that their case was going to be discussed in a paper, even though their name was not there. They worried that if any of their colleagues or friends were to read that thing, they would immediately understand who it was. So you have to be absolutely sure that all of this has been discussed before. The consequences of disagreements between researcher and subject on this sort of thing can be very severe. Reputational, lawsuits, and even complete withdrawal of all your research, which means that it becomes useless and a complete waste of time. Right, this is American, so no federal and state law, but probably would say here there are national laws and national guidelines that apply to research in South Africa and presumably in other countries as well. And there are certainly institutional guidelines here in the province, for example. There are guidelines that we have to follow from the provincial health department. There are guidelines that we have to follow from the university. And then they talk about practical security measures, confidential records having to be stored in a safe area. You have to try and take steps so that if somebody does manage to steal them, they can't breach confidentiality by working out who's who. Hence the idea of numbering patient records and then keeping the key as to which numbers which patient, completely separate with a different person, in a different place or in a different computer or a different room, so that one person who steals those records can't in fact identify anybody from them. Right. And then they mention things you may never have thought of. Confidential conversations that may be overheard. Okay. Or let's say, for example, you want to pay somebody for their transport, but you have to put their name on the requisition you send into university in order for them to be paid. Things like that that you may never think of, but could lead to a breach in confidentiality. So all of these things have to be thought of, and increasingly the ethics committee would expect you to spell out in detail how you're going to prevent all of these things happening. Right. So the other suggestion here is that we think about data sharing before the research begins and not when we've already got data. Okay. Patients and subjects often see things differently to the way we do. So we just know that the nature of science is that we share data. Your subject may not. So you may just mention in passing that you shared your data with an expert in America. You know, completely naively understanding that, of course, everybody will see you did it for a good reason and you weren't trying to breach confidentiality. But you may find that your subject sees it extremely differently. I thought that you were going to look at my data, doctor. I did not give permission for you to give it to anybody else, even if he is the most famous expert in the whole world. So beware of that. If you think you might want to do that, it's actually best to get permission for that upfront. And the other big warning here, understanding the limits of the internet. Most of us don't really understand just how easy it is for bad actors, for want of a better word, to breach the internet. Okay. A lot of my data is kept on Dropbox, okay, which has got many, many advantages. But to be honest, I don't know how secure it is against being hacked. Others, may be in similar conditions. So it's worth thinking about. And ideally, institutions themselves should draw up conditions and guidelines. I mean, none of us can be expected to be absolutely up to date and au fait with the latest in internet security. We know that the internet is being breached all the time, people's credit card numbers, personal details, banking details, etc. And the fifth and perhaps the most important one, tap into ethics resources. Okay, and I'm going to mention this in my last slide as well. So let's come to that. So just one slide on authorship, because as I said earlier, it is very, very contested. And you can find that your work, that you are placed in a very difficult position by fellows and particularly by bosses and supervisors and so on in terms of this. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is the authoritative body, recommends that authorship is based on the following. One, every author should have made a substantial contribution to the conception or design or the acquisition or analysis or interpretation of data for the work. Okay. So not doing a t-test, but if they helped you interpret your data, had you actually considered that maybe the systolic blood pressure is telling you something about the blah, 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 that is helping you with interpretation. Just saying this is significant is not helping you with interpretation. Secondly, drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. On quite a few occasions, you see, my name has been added to other people's work as an author, okay, when the manuscript was given to me to help them with, but that's not just because I rewrote it in nice English. I went through the entire paper, looked at the data, suggested other ways in which it could be interpreted in order to make the results more meaningful or the conclusions more important or something. So in other words, I wasn't just revising the work, I was actually making a substantial contribution to the interpretation and analysis of the data as well. Final approval of the version to be published. And the fourth one is agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Okay. So if you put your name down as an author, you agree that you will take responsibility if it turns out that the work is fraudulent, even though yourself were not the person that committed the fraud. Right. So those are the four principles, but the first two are really the most important. The author must have made a substantial contribution to conceptual design, acquisition, analysis, or interpretation, and a substantial contribution to basically writing the paper for its intellectual content, not just its English grammar and its punctuation. Okay. And very often those heads of departments fail utterly on that. They might have thrown out a sentence or two about what you might do at the start of your study. They may even have just looked through the manuscript at the end, but that is not making a substantial contribution to the intellectual property of the work. Right. So in conclusion, A knowledge of medical ethics is essential, but the best way forward is to consult online resources frequently. Okay, there is a wealth of material online. I mean, I've just kept a tiny fraction of a percentage of it today. And the more you read about it, the more you'll understand it. And the more you'll come across examples similar to the problems that you yourself are experiencing. And it's also highly advisable to complete formal online ethics training. And certainly in our university, you have to have done a certificate of good practice if you wish to be included as a researcher on a protocol for anything requiring human subjects. Right. Next point. As I mentioned earlier, rules vary by institution, country, and even for your journal. Make sure you're aware of all the relevant conditions that you need to conduct, that you need to meet in doing your research. So the good advice here. If in any doubt, find out. Also, if in any doubt, well, ask your ethics committee. It's the safest way to protect yourself against recriminations in the future is to say, I asked the ethics committee in writing. I wrote and said, would it be acceptable to broaden my subject population from people under 70 to people under 75? Okay, if the answer comes back, yes, it is, then nobody can blame you if questions are raised about that. And similarly, always keep the committee informed of any material change to your protocol. Often people are worried because their protocol says they will do this. As the study unfolds, they find it makes more sense to do that. Well, the trick is write a letter. Write a letter to the ethics committee stating your number and saying you wish to inform the committee and seek its approval for the following change. It's not necessary to rewrite the entire protocol or resubmit a whole new protocol. If it's not even relatively minor, but if it doesn't substantially change the whole direction of the project, then it's quite appropriate just to get permission for a change in protocol. And if in any doubt, do that. It's by far the safest way to head off problems in the future. Final point, which I haven't written here, but just remember, because I have seen some unpleasant cases, never start your study until you have ethics approval. Now, this can be a problem. Where does audit, as part of good medical practice, stop and research starts? I had to assist a colleague many years ago now, one of the professors, who thought of an interesting question. So he had a quick look through all his patients' records and found, yes, it did look like there was something to this question. So he then wrote a protocol and had submitted it to the ethics committee and said, looking through my data, I realized that XYZ, was 20% and ABC was 30%, therefore. And they reported him to the university for having conducted unauthorized research. They said by merely looking at his data and asking that question, he had effectively started the research. I must say, I actually thought that was very unfair. To me, it makes sense that you have a look to see if there's anything in your issue before you start the research. But the university actually supported the ethics committee. And that was a very worried colleague for a while. In the end, he wrote a humble letter saying he was terribly sorry and didn't know and wouldn't do it again. And the matter was allowed to rest. But it does highlight this issue, that research ethics is taken extremely seriously and don't take chances. Okay, that's all I have to say. Any questions, please let me know. Right, any comments? Oh, let's see, we've gone on a bit long, 4:45. Nothing on the chats? No. Okay, well then goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening in. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.